today. Today our speaker is Dr. Michael Hardinger. So Michael studies the ultra-low frequency waves and other phenomena related to solar wind, magnetosphere, ionosphere coupling, namely how the energy flows between the sun and the different regions in the near Earth space environment. He received his bachelor's degree in physics from Cornell University in 2006 and a PhD in geophysics and space physics from UCLA in 2012. He is currently a research scientist at the Space Science Institute and an assistant researcher at UCLA. His recent research focuses on wave-particle interactions in the Earth's radiation belts, geomagnetic disturbances, and north-south hemisphere symmetries in the solar wind magnetosphere ionosphere system. He also manages a network of autonomous instruments in Antarctica. And Mike is physically in Center Green these days, so you're welcome to talk to him this week or next week. Now let's turn it to Mike.
Thanks a lot, Dong. Thanks for the introduction, and it's great to be here at HAO. I'm really enjoying my visit and hope to chat with more people while I'm here over the next week or so. Thanks also for the opportunity to present at this colloquium. And today I'll be talking about some work myself and a large group have been involved in on citizen scientist analysis of plasma waves using satellite measurements. So before I get started, I just want to first of all thank all the co-authors on the Heliophysics Modified Resonances and Plasmas team. That's our NASA project that I'll be discussing. And with special thanks to Martin Archer and Emmanuel Masong who provide a lot of material for this talk. And also Shuling Shi here at HAO, who did a lot of the work on the data processing, and Evaldis Vidurgis at SSI, who really was the developer of the Unity GUI I'll be talking about. And again, also acknowledge support from NASA. So I want to kick it off with this question. Why don't heliophysics researchers use audio analysis? Why don't we use sound in our analysis? And if you think about the type of work that you do in your day-to-day, whether it's analyzing computer simulation data or looking at theory results or interpreting ground-based or satellite measurements, it almost always starts with visual inspection. You design an event detection algorithm, you're going to start by looking at a time series or a spectrogram. And so, think about this question. I'll come back to it at the end, but on a related question is why did heliophysics researchers stop using audio analysis? Because audio analysis is actually central to a lot of the early work on plasma waves, particularly the plasma waves that happen to have frequencies in the human audible range. So the words that we use to describe these waves are coming from the sounds that people heard when they were listening to these things through speakers in various with various measurements, things like chorus and hiss and whistler waves. And I'll play one example of that. This is from the Polar spacecraft measurement of a whistler wave. So again, just to warn you, I'm going to play a sound. I don't know how loud it's going to be on your speaker. Just be forewarned. So that was just a sample of a whistler wave, and there's some more. The sounds that you'll hear for things like chorus and hiss are going to be matching what the words are describing. So for many years, we were using audio recordings as a plasma wave research tool. We developed a taxonomy based on audio, but they're not. I would say with some rare exceptions, they're not very often used now, apart from public outreach. So public outreach. Sound has been really useful for many different satellite missions to sort of get people interested in plasma waves, but it's not really been used as a research tool. And so there was a recent study by Zanella et al. Looking at why sonification and sound aren't used in astronomy research, but there's a lot of analogies that can be made to heliophysics research. In general, we have a lack of familiarity and training with sonification. So we don't, when we're learning from the textbooks about plasma waves and so on, we're looking at visual, we're looking at time series. We're not looking at things like, or we're not listening to sounds. Similarly, there's a lack of standardization of tools. And so the type of work that we're doing, and I'll come back to this at the end, is trying to sort of address some of these challenges. So I'm going to zero in on one particular type of plasma wave or one particular frequency range, ultra low frequency waves in the Earth's magnetosphere. So these are often described as standing waves, and at least in the lower end of the range, the frequency range that I'll be talking about. I'm going to try to avoid using a lot of jargon in this talk and just kind of talk in generalities. And so one way to do that is to use analogies with musical instruments. So because these are sort of the largest scale waves that the magnetosphere can support, they're eigenmodes or standing waves. And so there are analogies to things like a string instrument. So, a harp or a guitar string. So basically each magnetic field line is like a string that can be plucked, or struck if the solar wind is hitting the magnetosphere. And the natural frequency of that standing wave will depend on sort of the density of the mass density of the plasma on the field line and the length of the field line. So just like in a guitar or harp, as you get a longer string, you'll get a lower frequency. There's also analogies that can be made to a variety of different standing waves that are sort of like radially trapped sound waves, magnetosonic waves. So when I say sound wave, I mean a wave in a plasma, but basically they're like a sound that you get out of a wind instrument, like an organ pipe or a flute. And as you change the size of an organ pipe, of course, the frequency is going to change. And as you compress or expand the magnetosphere, those natural frequencies are also going to change. And then you can also make an analogy with a drum to the day-side boundary between the solar wind and the magnetosphere. It's kind of like a stretched membrane. And as you change or expand or contract that membrane, you'll get different natural frequencies coming out. So we have theory to describe all of these things, and we can use detection algorithms to look at sort of discrete frequency waves that have the right polarizations or the right power peaks in the right frequency band. But what you often have in the magnetosphere is a superposition of all these things happening at the same time, and it's even more complicated than that, particularly during geomagnetic storms. You don't have like a symphony of things playing together. What you have is a cacophony as the magnetosphere is constantly retuning all these instruments as the mass density is evolving and as the boundary is shrinking and contracting. So it's really, it's possible to identify these individual instruments in a time series or a spectrogram, but it's a whole lot harder to identify all these cacophonies that you might get. Nevertheless, there are repeatable patterns, and I think that's one of the advantages of using sound that I'll be talking about, is that we can see some of these patterns that are more elusive when you're using visual identification. So I'm not going to go into too many details on the classifications that we use for ultra-low frequency waves, but just note that they're sort of having wave periods on the order of a few minutes, and at least the ones I'll be talking about, and wave frequencies that are sort of in the millihertz range or a few tens of millihertz. And so these are way below the human audible range, as I'll show in the next slide. So we have to do some processing to hear them. But they can be driven by many different things, by the solar wind, by processes in the magnetotail, by wave particle interactions. And again, it's basically just that you have all these different drivers that can happen at the same time. And it's really the challenge is to identify the superposition of all these things happening at once. And so we hope with sound and with visual all combined together, and also with big data, with lots of data collected from many different NASA satellites, ESA satellites, NOAA satellites, we can improve wave event classifications. Okay, so why bother using sound? What does sound give you that you can't get with visual analysis, which we almost exclusively use? Human hearing has benefits over typical visual analysis or computational analysis that's based on visual analysis when you're sort of identifying or developing the algorithm. So things like time, frequency, acuity, blind source separation, these are different areas of research or different topics about the types of patterns that the human auditory system can pick out that are unique. And so I think one analogy that often gets made is the cocktail party problem, where you have the ability, or some people have the ability, to pick out a conversation on the other side of the room when you're in a party and talking to a bunch of people. So it's kind of like our ears are just good at picking out certain types of patterns that might be more elusive if we were just using visual identification. And like I said before, we were using audio before in heliophysics. We just don't use it a lot now, but it's still used widely in many other fields, like people who study birds, for example. It's a central part of their research methodologies. And it can complement visual inspection methods. And that's what we'll be doing. We're not going to throw out visual identification. We're going to use it together with sound to identify new patterns. So what we'll be doing specifically is a particular type. So sonification is a broad term that talks about using sound to represent data. we're doing audification, which is a subset of that methodology, which is just a one-to-one mapping of data to audio samples. And in our case, it's essentially just speeding up the playback so UF waves become audible, with one twist that I'll talk about a little later. And so you can play this kind of game that's shown in this chart here. You can look at sampling rates and the wave UF frequency bands here. This is frequency here on the top of this x-axis here. And you can look at where the human audible range lies, and you can see what amount of resampling you have to do, or what amount of speed up do you have to do to the time series in order to hear these various frequency bands. So in our case, we were kind of targeting, in the first study I'll be talking about, we were targeting frequencies on the order of a few millihertz, sort of in this range. And when you apply the resampling rate, you can transform 1 year of data into about 6 minutes. So you're going through data a lot faster, but you can pick out patterns like over multiple days in terms of the changes in wave activity. And so there's advantages and disadvantages. And so the first project I'll be talking about is going to do this kind of simple speed up. The second project I'll talk about is going to do a little bit of another twist to enable you to hear shorter duration wave events. Oh, sorry, there was actually a sound there, but I'm going to skip it because it's going to be related to a sound I play later. Okay, so that's the benefit you get with sound, or that's a bit about the benefit you get with using sound analysis. So the project that kind of got the current NASA project started was actually in the UK. It was a citizen science project led by Martin Archer, who's shown down here. And it was basically, it was when Martin was at Queen Mary University in London, and it was meant to bring space science into the curriculum of high schools in London. So the primary objective was to kind of, get students involved in meaningful research projects. But as a nice bonus to that, you could do sort of exploratory citizen science. And so what the students did is they were kind of, in multiple sessions, they learned about space weather and space physics, and they learned about the method, the type of data that's being shown here, which is actually NOAA GOES satellite magnetometry data. And they were trained on how to load the data in this graphical user interface called Audacity. It's a freely available or free open source sound analysis software. So they were trained how to use it, and they were trained how to basically pick out different events and put them into an Excel spreadsheet to get things like the spacecraft local time and what the wave frequency was and so on. And then they could kind of design their own research project to look at things like how does the wave activity evolve during a storm. But you had all these high school students looking at the data and listening to the data over about 1 year of GOES satellite data. And very quickly, I guess I should mention this really quickly, the processing that was used is basically what I already talked about. They took 1 year of GOES satellite magnetometer data, put it into a coordinate system where they could basically look for the types of waves that were of interest. So field line coordinate system is kind of a natural system to look at these waves. And then they did some filtering, and they rescaled the data to audible frequencies to get a 6-minute audio file. So all the students would listen to this basically the same year of data, and they had their own research projects, but a large portion of them picked out a very very repeatable pattern, and it was basically I'll show you the animation on the next slide that was in the press release for this paper a couple of years ago, but they basically were able to see. There was during almost every storm that year in 2013, you had this blast of white noise when the Meniopods moved inward, and you had lots of wave activity, lots of strong wave activity. But then over many days, as the GOES spacecraft passed through the same local time sector at dusk, they picked out these discrete frequency waves that are driven by a ring current interaction. And the new thing was that this pattern was that these waves, always were there over with a descending tone over many days. And so I'll get into this on a later slide. We kind of knew that these waves might be there before, but the particular way that the waves evolved in time was new, and that was something that was thought to be rare. So let me just play this the next slide, and you'll be able to hear. Again, warning, I'm going to play sound, but hopefully it won't be too loud, and you'll hear what I'm talking about, this descending tone. So all the sound that you're going to hear here is over about 1 week of data. So that was again, a repeatable pattern. That was just one example, but there was, I think, 23 of these events that the students picked out in 1 year of data. And it was very repeatable. You know, when you talk about crowdsourcing, like all these students were hearing this pattern. And so, and it's the type of thing that you, as I'll show on this slide, it's a type of thing that you wouldn't really know to look for, this general trend. You would know, I mean, there have been a lot of studies that have shown that you have this preference for what we call poloidal mode waves. So like the radially polarized magnetic field waves that are driven by ring current interactions. So we know those waves occur during geomagnetically active conditions. That's very well known. But the particular progression that they saw in all these storms where you had this, you know, white noise, then you had these very monochromatic waves that were also multi-harmonic waves lasting over many days, always in the same local time sector and always having this descending tone. That was really a unique pattern that was thought to be rare. So there were case studies that were identified like this before, but it was just that. It was just like 2 case studies. And it was proposed that you would rarely get these really monochromatic waves. And so again, they found 21 of these events in just 1 year of data. And so the thing is, like, how do you design without knowing a priori that you're looking for this particular pattern? How do you design a detection algorithm that looks for descending tone poloidal mode waves that start during the initial phase of a storm and then last for somewhere between 3 to 7 days or whatever they found? So because it's not always 3 days, it's not always 5 days, it's not always 7 days. So it's hard to design these things a priori without knowing that they're there. But when you listen to the data over a year, you can always say, after every storm, there's this descending tone over multiple days. So this is sort of the benefit where you can bring in the audio analysis, and then later you can go back and look at the visual analysis and see what patterns emerge in the data that are repeatable from one storm to another. So that kind of motivated us to do a follow-on project using a different satellite. This is what kind of instigated the Heliophysics Modified Resonances and Plasmas project. So this is a citizen science seed funding grant where our goal was to take the methodology that Martin was using in the UK with that Audacity software and the Excel spreadsheets and adapt it to an audience in the US with more streamlined tools. So we knew that we wouldn't always have the ability to meet with students over hours and hours and hours over multiple sessions. We wanted something that people could just get started with right away with a few minutes of training, learning about the science and how to use the GUI. So we developed a new GUI, or we are developing a new GUI, and we're currently beta testing it with high school students and also university students and researchers. And eventually we're going to analyze the data. I'll show some preliminary analysis at the end of this talk. But so our acronym is HARP. At the time we wrote this, we thought the other HARP was not going anymore, but then it fortunately restarted, but now there's 2 HARPs. So you have to remember there's a HARP with 1A and there's also the HARP we all know that has 2 A's. But the HARP that we're talking about is actually this massive magnetic HARP in the Earth's magnetosphere. So this is kind of like, if you imagine each magnetic field line as you move away from the Earth gets longer and longer. Generally, in the outer magnetosphere, at least, as you move outward, the frequency gets lower because these field lines are getting longer and longer. So if you are a satellite like THEMIS or MMS moving outward, you're going to sample all of these different frequency strings as you move outward, and you'll potentially identify this pattern of decreasing frequency as you move out, and then increasing frequency as you move in. And so that's been studied before. There's been a lot of great studies. There's a paper with THEMIS by Theodore Saris. There's also papers using the MTCC spacecraft, which had a slightly lower or a somewhat lower apogee than THEMIS by Engerbretson et al. And others. And so what they were doing in these papers in the 80s was using basically orbit by orbit, looking at these types of spectrograms. And what you see here is one orbit of MTCCE data, magnetometry data. If you just look at the middle panel, as the satellite is moving away from the Earth, you see these discrete frequency peaks. This is frequency on the y-axis. You see these discrete frequency peaks that sort of decrease in frequency and time. And then here's where the satellite kind of hits its furthest point from the Earth, and then it starts to move back in again, and the frequencies increase. So this is the HARP. This is what we're talking about. And it's something that you'll see right away, even in this one orbit. You'll notice that the lines on this side of the orbit look different than on that side of the orbit. There's some higher frequencies here. The frequencies go up a little bit faster. So even on a single orbit, because of the time evolution of these waves, the retuning of the magnetosphere, and also because of spatial differences in different regions of the magnetosphere, you're going to see differences. So we wanted to address the question, under what conditions do we see this, really clean continuum of staying alpine waves versus when we see just kind of white noise or broadband frequency waves, or something that doesn't quite look like the HARP, where you have the frequency increase and then decrease, or decrease and then increase before you do half orbit. And so I would say that we have really good theory and modeling of these things. We have lots of satellite measurements, but we haven't yet got to the point where we can really predict what driving conditions are going to yield this kind of full continuum of standing alpine wave frequencies. In part because, again, we have that complex, those complex processes going on in the Ionosphere. So, so yeah, that's what we set out to do, is kind of look back, first of all, work with the citizen scientists, see if we can replicate some of the results that were found by Engelbretson et al. And an Anderson et al. Paper I'll be talking about a little later, but also see if we can find new patterns that emerge and get a better understanding of like how these things evolve during a storm. And again, when we see this full continuum of alpine wave frequencies. So our data processing is that we're using the NASA Themis satellites. We are, first of all, doing everything in Python, and thanks to Schuling here at HAO, as well as Merritt Cottingham and Imperial College in London for leading that Python code development. And it's open source, so anyone can grab it. It loads the Themis data from STSW. You can also load data in other ways with the code. It does some processing that we need to do. Themis is a little different than GOES because it has a higher apogee orbit, so we have to be aware of crossing into the Magneto sheath, so we kind of get rid of those data before we generate the audio. And then we generate the audio with the dynamic power spectrogram. We do that speed up, the yodification of the data. And we do one other step for Themis that I alluded to earlier, this time stretching, which is a method to slow down audio playback while preserving the pitch and the frequency. And I'll show an example of that a little bit later. But the one thing to mention here is that getting back to that first slide I showed about why people don't use sonification, there wasn't, it wasn't like we could just start with Themis data and say, okay, there's a prescription for how you should, you turn this into a sound. There are prescriptions. You can look back at papers on how to look visually at UF wave data. There's tons of examples of the best way to look at a power spectrogram or the best way to inspect the time series. But there's nothing like that for audio, at least not in heliophysics or UF wave research. So our first step was to try to kind of internally figure out with some test data what would enable us to hear these patterns, and then take that test data and also take real data and let people listen to this in a wider group and tell us what the best way that they found to pick out the data. So this is another study that Martin Archer led. It was a public survey. The paper describes more details of our data processing that I mentioned on the last slide, but it also talks about a public survey where again, these sounds were listened to by the public, and the best methods for wave identification were determined. So when I say public, I mean he reached out specifically to people who are doing heliophysics research, to people who are working with citizen scientists, people who are audio experts, and people who are doing public outreach and education. So it's not quite the general public, but it was a fairly large group of people. And so what we gave them was a few different options for different sounds to listen to, including how much we're going to do that time stretch, what type of time stretching we'll do, and also this other feature about whitening or not whitening the spectra. And so this gets into the fact that people have different high frequency sensitivity with their ears. And when you whiten a spectra, you tend to bias, or you tend to amplify the higher frequencies relative to the lower frequencies. And that can create a harsh sound that wasn't very pleasant for a lot of people. So we in the end, didn't quite do the original whitening, or we're not planning to do the original whitening that we were doing. But anyway, we got good results from the public survey, and that led us to what we ultimately did for our audification tools in the GUI that we've now implemented in our beta testing. So what I'm showing you here are the idealized data that we were working with, and then real data from Themis. So the idealized data on the left is a time series and a spectrogram, where we basically just gave a sample Themis orbit, and then we took from theory, or I think actually empirical model of standing alpine wave frequencies. And that's sort of this HARP, this U shape is basically, again, the satellite moves away from the Earth. It gets into the longer and the longer HARP string, so the frequency gets lower, and then it starts moving back in again, and it sees the higher frequencies. So we did that one, and then we give them a third harmonic. So there's two harmonics now playing, which is very typical. You'll often see multiple harmonics in the data too. There's way more cleaner ones than the example I'm showing here. And then we also give them white noise. So now I'm going to play, because I wanted to give you a sense of why we do the time stretching. I'm going to play you one sound at the top here that corresponds to a straight up modification where we do no time stretching at all. So keep in mind, this is a lot faster. It's going to be a lot faster than what we saw before in the GOES study, because I'm only showing you about 3 days of data. So that went by really fast. And so that kind of, so you can do a lot with that if you're looking for like patterns over many, many days. But if you want to see sort of like a pattern on a given half orbit, it's a lot easier if you can kind of slow that down without changing the frequency and the pitch. And that's where, again, why we use the time stretching, which I'll play right now. Yeah. So yeah, so that was the idealized data. You might have heard that watery sound, that like bubbling brook. That's an artifact. Well, it's not quite an artifact. It's kind of what you hear as white noise when you apply the particular type of time stretch method. So that's something we just have to deal with when we're doing time stretching. And I can get into a little more of those details a little bit later. But the goal here is, again, that you can slow down and still hear the frequency change corresponding to this pattern that we're looking for. So the way this works, and I'm actually I think I'll have enough time I can actually demo the GUI in real time, but the citizen scientists will draw a box around the patterns. First, we show them the training data. We give them some guidance. There's a training mode. They learn how to draw a box around the particular patterns that we're looking for. And then they go out the data and they start to identify events and they make comments and they record how many harmonics and so on. And so we started by our beta test by working with a group of high school students. Actually, it's a group of students that were involved in a library program here in Boulder. And I can get into the details of the IRB we did and all that if people are interested. But basically, the main goal with working with those high school students was to just get feedback on the GUI design and figure out what we need to change for version 2. Oh, sorry for the harsh noise there. So this is version 1.0 of our GUI before we worked with the high school students. Just some background, it was created in Unity. So that's the engine we use that was developed by Valdis Vidurgas at SSI. And it's based on a lot of previous experience at SSI with education tools, online games like Magnetic Golf and Magnetic Bowling that they've developed. You don't need any software to run it, just a web browser. And you get the simultaneous audio playback where you can also see the spectrogram in the time series. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a tutorial mode as well that demonstrates how you can identify events. So this is version 2.0. And so we're on the second phase of our beta test now. You might have noticed if I flash back the last slide, our spectrogram got larger. And a lot of people have told us that they hardly use the waveform at all. They basically just, when they're listening to the sound, really the only other thing they're paying attention to is the spectrogram. And so we're still talking about how best to use the waveform. It was meant to give context in how large the amplitude of the waves are because our spectrogram is normalized. But we're still kind of figuring out how to explain that and how to use the waveform. But that changed. There's a mark event is completed that changed. There's a lot of other things that changed behind the scenes in terms of how we were collecting the data and serving the events to the citizen scientists. And so now we're testing again with students and researchers, mostly at UCLA, but also elsewhere. A couple of people here in Boulder are helping us too. We're wrapping up that beta test now, and we're hoping to have our version 3.0 later this year. And then it'll hopefully be posted to the NASA website early next year. So let me just I think I have enough time. I'm going to just try to demo the GUI really quickly. Let's see. So hopefully you can see this. So basically the way it works, this is version 2.0. And this is real data from 3 orbits of Themis. So you can kind of see the Themis orbit. Again, all the data we load is coming from CDAW. So we just load the position data of the Themis satellite, and you can see the orbit lines here corresponding to the orbit on those 3 days. So what'll happen is you'll play the sound. Hopefully this will work. And again, I'm not sure. I'm going to put the volume down a bit here. Hopefully that won't make it too loud. Oh, it's actually way fainter. Let me put it louder. So you might have seen there was a couple that resemble the Alfvén continuum, and definitely this one, for example. At least for me personally, I see at least 2 harmonics. So I'm going to go ahead and draw a box. And then you can record some information. You can record how many harmonics you think you see. You can record if you see a mix of, this is actually something we're revising now. The people didn't like the words that we're using. So we're trying to better describe what we mean by tone and mix of tones and random noise. But I'm just gonna say mix of tones just goes up. So this, whether the frequency is increasing or decreasing, those kinds of things. How confident are you? I'm gonna say I'm very confident. And you can also enter in general comments. So I'm just gonna write standing Alfvén waves. And you can submit it. And then you see that it was saved, and you can do another one. And you can, again, mark the event as completed, and you'll see some information pop up there. You can, play the sound over and over again. You can zoom in, and you can change the contrast, or you can change the scales to see if you can see things a little easier. Like this looks like actually maybe it's 3 harmonics when I change it. So all these things can be played with, and we're really trying to refine how we do that tutorial mode I mentioned earlier to make sure everyone is aware of how to identify these things and having both clear instructions on what patterns to look for, while also giving them the freedom to sort of pick events that might not be matching what we typically think of, or that match the textbook example that I showed, and might actually be something a little bit different. Like maybe this thing right here might be a harp, but it's just a part of a harp. There's a lot of variety. If anyone who's looked at satellite data over multiple orbits like this will tell you that things can change quite a bit orbit to orbit. So yeah, we're still beta testing. Let me go back to the presentation again. Oops, wrong thing here. Just do this. So we're still beta testing, but I did want to talk really briefly about the first results from our first beta test. Again, these were the Boulder High School students. Mostly, again, we were talking to them to get feedback on the GUI, and they were super helpful. They did a lot of great work to try to give us information on how to change the GUI. They were also on an AGU abstract or AGU presentation last year led by Annie Holland at SSI. But also, during that, we had 4 of those high school students actually went through all 90 events that we provided, which was amazing. So we actually were able to get a good amount of information about the types of waves they were identifying and see if, broadly speaking, if it matched with our expectations from theory and past observations. So from past observations, we know that these types of waves, the particular type of wave that we kind of asked them to identify, toroidal mode, standing Alfvén waves in this continuum, those tend to occur in the dawn sector. And they tend to be a little more clear during slightly active conditions. And they tend to have, you can see multiple harmonics, but you would rarely see more than 5 harmonics, usually more like 1 or 2, depending on how you define or how strict you are in identifying harmonics. So we saw that they only identified, typically 1 or 2 harmonics. We saw they saw more events at dawn. And actually, I'm going to go to this slide, which is kind of an interesting one. So here is just 2 bar charts that break down the 4 different users and how they were similar and how they were different in some cases. I'm just going to briefly touch on the harmonics one. So you can see that by and large, they were identifying, all of the users were tending to identify 1 or 2 harmonics, the blue and the orange curved bars. Very few events with 3, 4, or 5 harmonics were identified. But then I just to highlight the power of crowdsourcing and also the issue that different people can agree or disagree on the pattern. If you look at the one on the right, most of the citizen scientists, the high school students, were very consistent in terms of identifying the same HARP events in dawn and during active conditions. Active is defined by KP. So they all picked out about 10 to 12 events in the dawn sector, and they're all actually pretty much the same event that they were all seeing, the same events. Then if you look at dusk, all of them picked out very few events at dusk. Again, that's consistent with that Anderson study I showed on the last slide. But then if you look at dawn quiet, dawn moderate, look at the vast differences that some of them got. So like this student picked out, I think, 23 events. This student picked out 1 event, and the others were somewhere in between. So there's a big difference there. And so we're trying to understand why, there are these big differences. So this is where we hope that crowdsourcing will help, and also, improvements in our training mode to try to understand why there's such a big difference between these different events. And, it's very much possible that, if you gave 4 scientists, 4 ULF researchers, the same set of events, the same GUI, you might get a spread like this. I don't know. I mean, I think it's kind of we need to look at the data and see what these events actually look like. Like, what were the events that this person identified that weren't seen by these other people? So the other thing, as I mentioned earlier, you have this free response capability, and this is a really powerful tool to get back into this kind of exploratory research mode. So these are some of the sample comments we got from the beta testers. The first one is just highlighting the utility of using sound in a complement to visual. So why do we want to use sound at all? Why not just use the spectrograms and have them pick those out? So like, as this person points out, they were planning not to mark it when they were just looking at the spectrogram, but then the sound spectrum convinced me that you might not be imagining the upward curve, or I might not be imagining the upward curve. So it was helpful for them to hear the sound and to know that there was something happening behind that kind of noisy curve. The next two comments are just kind of descriptive. So this person described a twirling noise. I'm not sure what that means, but it's it's something that they picked out. Another one picked out a sound that was like a very muddy puddle. So again, it's kind of like, if maybe we'll develop new classification schemes, new taxonomies, kind of like you had chorus and hiss and whistler waves. Maybe there's like the very muddy puddle mode that happens after a geomagnetic storm. I don't know, but it's kind of nice to see these descriptive things. And when we're finding that there's the same event that multiple people are commenting on, it kind of gives us a clue that we should look into that event and see what's going on. And then the last one was interesting just because it gets back to our science question. This one is interesting. It seems much less uniform than the others because it goes up and down before the apogee point is reached. So this is something that could happen if you have a sharp density gradient, like a plasma pause. This is something that we know from theory, that the frequency should go up and down. But it's really, really nice to see that they can pick this out, and that this person picked this out, because it's something that we'll be able to, when we start having 100 people or 1,000 people hopefully look at this, we can pick out, when does that type of trend occur versus other trends where you have just the steadily decreasing frequency. And there's all kinds of applications of having that kind of information in terms of knowing what the background mass density is doing in the magnetosphere, and just knowing, what events, what driving conditions lead to these types of waves. So I'm basically at my summary. I just have 2 more slides. Just to summarize, we have a recent paper talking about the audification techniques. These techniques have been applied to NOAA-GOES and NASA Themis satellites. There's a paper in Space Weather in 2018 talking about that ULF wave mode I mentioned earlier that happens during the recovery phase of storms. Basically, we're thinking that the audio detection methods complement visual methods, and also has the potential for discovering new phenomena and rapidly exploring large data sets. And of course, this is a great way to get involved in bring together the public into research, and really taking advantage of crowdsourcing. So instead of having one set of eyes from one researcher looking at the data, having 100 or 1,000, it's a lot easier to convince people to review your data when you're using sound, as opposed to just telling them to look at a time series over like 10 years. So it's really another angle here that's kind of nice about using sound. And again, it's a great way to get students involved, as Martin showed in the UK, and hopefully we can do in the US as well. And also to attract diverse groups to space science research, non-traditional STEM students, musically inclined, blind and low vision communities, for example. So I want to finish this with like the question I started with, and back to this Zanella et al. Paper. So what are the challenges? Why don't we use sound in our research? A lack of training and familiarity with sonification, a lack of standardization, evaluation, dissemination. So we're trying to address this with what we're doing, developing this protocol, these standard data processing tools, the process of trying to pick out the ideal audification parameters. So you're not just kind of arbitrarily speeding something up. You're trying to figure out what the best steps to do the audio processing, so that with your particular ear, you can pick out the patterns of interest. And of course, this GUI that can be adapted to other problems. And just wanted to advertise that NASA and NSF are both encouraging citizen science these days. And NASA just released a new incentive that they will contribute 1% of a PI mission budget to citizen science efforts on new satellite missions. So, if you want to use our GUI, it's there and available to adapt to any problem. There's a lot of different open questions out there on other plasma waves, not just ULF waves. So, yeah, I'll just close by saying, think about ways you can use sound in your own work. And then the last slide, before I say thank you, I just want to reference a couple of papers that were really useful here. The papers I mentioned from Martin Archer, Robert Alexander is the first paper there. He did a ton of work in this, and we've been using his analysis from his thesis and his papers as well. The Zanella et al. Review. And then also, if you're interested at all in any of the stuff I talked about, there's going to be a report soon by the UN on using sound in research in space science. And it's a really great review of all of the above, basically. So with that, I'll just say thanks and see if there's any questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mike. The people online have questions? Oh, wait, that's it. Well, Alessandra says, great talk, thanks, Mike. Okay, Hanley, in the room.
Mike, I wonder, you mentioned the rescale the frequency, right, to make it audible. How much do you have to scale the amplitude to make it audible? Is it really quiet? You have to like multiply 1,000 or something?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me, for those, I don't know if everyone could hear that, but basically the question was, we talked about rescaling the frequency, but what about rescaling the audio? So like some events can be very loud, some can be very quiet. And we normalize, essentially, is the answer to that. So we normalize it so that the loudness is in a certain range. I'm trying to remember how it works in the data processing, but I think the tool that we use to convert to a sound does that normalization. There's a Python package that will convert a time series into a sound, and there are options for doing that. And I believe you can do it in such a way that the loudness is in a certain range. So yeah, you could, if you just played the, if you just didn't normalize, there would be a big difference in the loudness from event to event. And because we do that normalization, that was actually the reason we wanted to have the waveform there, because that is the only information that currently is on the GUI that they'll interact with, that gives some indication of how large an amplitude these things are. So we do normalize it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Hanley. Yeah, raise hand. Arvinder, sorry if I pronounced the name not right. Please unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Cool. Just one more question with respect to the advantage of auditory processing over visual processing. There's some stuff that the human visual processing, I guess, engine can do. Like one thing that comes to mind is because you were talking about the number of harmonics you can identify. So there's subitizing, right, where you can just look at a thing and without actually physically counting the number of objects, you can kind of estimate the quantity. And that's something that you tend to notice if there's a bunch of pens lying around on a desk. You can just estimate how many there are without actually physically counting them. Is there anything like that that is unique to the auditory processing thing that is useful for this stuff? And and with respect to using both at the same time, I was just wondering, in terms of the studies that you quoted at the very end with the students, did they also analyze the flares? Sorry, not the flares. The magnetic field data visually, using the visual spectrogram representations in addition to the auditory, and then do those results compare?
Yeah, great questions. I'll address the second question first. Let me do this way. So the answer to the second question is yes. The first project also did the, oops, oh wait, I have to do that. Let me just do it this way. I guess I can just leave it like this. So the first study, yes, they did use it, because in Audacity, they will see, it's very similar to the GUI we have, in the sense that you'll see a time series and you'll see a spectrogram, and there's lots of other, let me actually try to make it full screen, because I want to show you the details of the GUI. Yeah, so if you can see, it's probably hard to see, but with Audacity, you'll see the time series. This is one full year of data. You'll see the spectrogram. The way he trains them to use it, he shows them how to do that, how to make this visualization. And then you'll have lots of other options that you can zoom in and zoom out. But the answer is yes, they do see both the time series spectrogram as well as hear the sound at the same time. That's basically how Audacity is running in the way that he was using it. And then to answer your first question, I I'm definitely not an expert on this, but the two themes that I've typically heard for the advantages of the human auditory system are time, frequency, acuity, and blind source separation. So I don't think I can give you a good answer other than to say that Wikipedia would give you an answer, or even better, some of those references that I have at the end. The only thing I've read about really is the cocktail party problem, which basically is that you can pick out a pattern in a noisy background. So in that sense, I guess it's kind of like you would kind of see something out of the corner of your eye. I guess you would pick out a pattern that is just not obvious immediately, or it's very faint. But I can't give you a very good answer though at this point. But it's a great question. I mean, the answer is basically that there are lots of researchers who have looked into this, and there are certain patterns that you can see or hear a lot more with your ears. With one caveat, actually, I want to mention one thing, that with all of this discussion with pattern recognition and visual and audio analysis, it really depends person to person. Some people are not particularly sensitive to certain frequency ranges with their ear. Some people are, there's obviously blind and low vision people who can't see. So like people develop different strengths and weaknesses for using different, senses. And I think basically using both of them is great, because you can kind of, take advantage of whichever one the person is most adept with. So having a large number of people, with each person having their own unique, blend of whether they're better with visual or audio analysis, is the best way of all, I think.
Thank you.
Okay. Any more questions? Actually, I have two questions. So firstly, you have shown mainly the UF wave range. So ideally, what's the limit of the frequency band that you can modify?
Yeah, I think this figure probably helps. Basically the first step in any of this stuff is to figure out roughly the frequency range you're interested in. And so you can look at this plot and you can say, okay, I'm interested in the PC5 band. If I choose an audio sampling rate ratio to spacecraft sampling rate of 10, that won't work, because it's still way below the human audible range. So you have to boost up the sampling rate to something like 10 to the 5 resampling, which is why you get this 1 year and 6 minutes thing. But you can also see that there's a bunch of different resamplings that would work for the PC5 range. And depending on what you choose, you'll land in different ranges of the human audible range. And so you can see that if you want to span, you can't span the entire UOF band from the PC6, I guess, is on this chart, or PC. If you just start PC5, for example, let's follow this curve here. You can almost do the whole band, but you'll miss some of the PC1 waves. So you have to choose what resampling rate you want, and that means you have to decide which frequency range you want. And then you also, and I was actually just talking with the group from HARP and actually Alessandro Pacini was on this call about like the fact that we need to calibrate to different human ears, because some people are less sensitive to the higher frequencies. So if you wanted to have people really target the PC1 range, you'd want to put that sampling rate lower, resampling rate lower, so that you would cover kind of the middle of the band or the lower band. So the people that can't hear the higher frequencies would be sensitive. So there's all these different factors to consider, and probably there isn't a sampling rate that would work for the entire UF band, but you can cover most of it with the appropriate sampling rate, resampling rate.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think my second question is related. So like you mentioned, also showed in another plot. So for the same signal, a group of users may have different results, right? How do you deal with that deviation? So do you just simply take the answer with the most responses? Any information you can dig from, like the deviation from other users?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one we're still trying to answer, because we've just barely started with this. So I think this first group of 4 people has kind of been really illuminating, because we can see that there are these big differences. And basically the idea there are a lot of citizen science projects that have dealt with this issue before, this issue of crowdsourcing. And the idea is that you kind of you can do it a few ways. One is that you can look at, as these different users or citizen scientists start to look at many events, you can look at, if there are patterns, like maybe this user, if for example, you have an expert look through the data and do all the event classifications that they see, if you see that users more or less match what the expert does, but they find other patterns, then they should be weighed heavily, versus a user that's like, when you give them an event that's like really obviously the pattern of the standing alpha waves, for example, and they don't see it, or they identify something completely different, then you might weigh that user less heavily in the statistics, or not at all. So this is something that's been done in ornithology. There's a project called Soundscapes to Landscapes that does exactly that. They have an expert who will listen to a random sampling of bird calls, and then you have citizen scientists that listen to thousands or hundreds of thousands or whatever of these, and then they can see how well do they match the expert, and then if they're really far off, then they might not be used in the statistics.
Okay, great. More questions from the online audience or in the room? Well, I think this is really exciting. I think this is the first time I saw people just audify the all kinds of physical signal that we have dealing with. I'm not sure if in the future people will try to turn them into taste or smell. But also it's very valuable to turn that into citizen science that involve especially the students. One last round. Questions? And again, Michael will be here till the end of next week. Feel free to come over to his office to talk to him if you are interested in this talk or other projects that he has been working on. If not, that's the end of this talk. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.